Somewhere along the sweating bayous of southern Louisiana, the air itself was too thick to breathe. Cicadas screamed through the night as if warning the living to stay awake. But inside the houses of 11 men, men who believed they owned the night, there was only silence. At 2 a.m., a match flared, a door creaked, and one by one, throats opened like red smiles across the pillows of power. The papers would blame heat madness, fever, revenge from freedmen. They would never print the truth, that the same woman had been in all their beds. They called her Lave Noire, the Black Widow. But that name came later, whispered by midwives and undertakers who swore they saw her shadow move before the bodies were cold. You were never supposed to hear this story. The archives were sealed in 1873 by order of a judge whose signature still stains with dried blood. Every mention of her erased, every record burned, except one. A single line in the parish death ledger. All 11 found smiling. Tonight, that silence breaks. You're about to learn what happens when the oppressed stop praying for mercy and start delivering judgment. But to understand why she came, to understand the quiet storm that grew behind her eyes, we must return to the ruins of a war that promised freedom and delivered only ghosts. The year was 1868. The South was rotting beneath the mask of Reconstruction. Plantations lay like carcasses, grand, skeletal, infested with debt and shame. The men who once cracked whips now hid behind courtrooms and uniforms. They called themselves Knights of the White Camellia, the elegant cousin of the Ku Klux Klan. They didn't burn crosses, they wrote laws. They didn't lynch in daylight, they starved justice quietly in the dark. St. Martin Parish was their stronghold, a place where freedom walked with its head bowed. 11 men ran it like a secret government. 11 signatures decided who could speak, who could work, who could live. Until she arrived. A steamboat coughed to the dock one April morning. From its smoke stepped a woman dressed in mourning black silk, carrying a single trunk and a smile that made men forget their sins. Her name was Celeste Dufresne, or so she claimed. She spoke like Paris, but watched like a predator. Her eyes were the color of wet earth after a grave is dug. Within weeks, the most powerful men in the parish were fighting for her attention. A glance in the market, a shared laugh outside Mass, a private dinner behind drawn curtains. She listened to their stories, their confessions, their hatred of the new world rising around them, and she memorized every word. They thought she was mourning a husband. They never realized she was avenging an entire generation, because each of those men had earned a grave that justice refused to dig. Each had blood on his hands that no rain could wash away. And Celeste Dufresne, whatever her true name was, had come to collect. In the dead heat of July, the first neck opened. By August, the second. The officials called them isolated incidents, but the colored sections of town knew better. They spoke the phrase softly, like prayer and curse combined. Lave Noire walks tonight. You see, every system built on fear believes its monsters will obey forever. But sometimes, a monster learns to smile back. And this is where we begin our descent. Not into crime or vengeance, but into power itself, the dark kind that blooms when justice dies. In the spring of 1868, Louisiana was a graveyard pretending to be a state. The war had ended, but peace was only a word carved on paper. The swamps steamed with rot and memory. Soldiers limped home to nothing but ruined plantations and unmarked graves. Freedmen walked the same roads in silence, free by law, but haunted by the same men who had once owned their names. The federal troops that occupied towns like Breaux Bridge were tired, underpaid, and desperate to leave. The illusion of order rested in the hands of those who had mastered deceit. And in that fragile quiet, 11 men reassembled their world from the bones of the old one. They were called the Knights of the White Camellia, planters, judges, sheriffs, doctors, and merchants, whose hands had never dirtied with fieldwork, but whose fortunes had been built upon it. They met behind shuttered doors, wearing their respectability like armor, imagining themselves the last guardians of civilization. They did not burn crosses, they drafted laws. They did not wear hoods, they wore suits stitched in New Orleans, scented with cologne imported from France. When the sun fell, they gave orders that erased men from existence without ever drawing a blade. A whisper, a signature, a debt unpaid. These were the new tools of the old cruelty. And as their power tightened, so too did their fear. They knew the day would come when what they had done in the dark would crawl into the light. She arrived on a Tuesday. The steamboat from New Orleans hissed against the dock as its passengers disembarked beneath a sky swollen with heat. Among them stood a woman in black silk, her figure perfectly straight, her face half hidden beneath a parasol. She carried one trunk, nothing more, but the weight of it made two porters strain. Her accent was French, the polished kind that made even insults sound like compliments. She introduced herself to the person, hotel clerk, as Madame Celeste Defrin, widow of a merchant taken by yellow fever the previous summer. She requested a room for a month and paid in gold, each coin placed on the counter like punctuation marks in a story only she knew how to tell. To the men of Breaux Bridge, she was a curiosity, an exotic interruption in a landscape of sweat and decay. She took her meals alone, wrote letters in precise handwriting, and attended Mass every Sunday, always sitting where the sunlight broke through the stained glass in red. The priests nodded respectfully. The women whispered, the men stared too long. She never sought attention, but she radiated it, like perfume, like danger. Within weeks, her name passed between the lips of every man who held power in the parish. She was polite to all, encouraging to none, yet somehow made each man feel as if her glance lingered an extra moment when it fell upon him. It was Thomas Broussard who first believed the illusion. He met her outside the general store, where she was touching bolts of fabric with gloved fingers, testing the weave. He offered his help, as a gentleman should. She smiled, a small, deliberate smile that pulled him into its gravity. When she spoke, her voice carried the rhythm of rivers. She spoke of property, of solitude, of grief. Broussard, who had overseen the burning of freedmen's cabins months earlier, found himself speaking softly, deferentially, as if she were royalty. He escorted her back to the hotel, and as they parted, she touched his arm in thanks. He felt that touch for days afterward, even when he tried not to think about it. By the next week, he was inventing reasons to see her again. He offered to show her land, to advise her on property purchases. Each time she accepted, graciously, without eagerness, as though she were indulging his kindness. They rode out beyond the town, the buggy wheels cutting through soft earth, his heart beating faster than it had since youth. She listened to him speak of history, of commerce, of progress, but she never revealed much of herself. When she laughed, it was quiet, like water running over stones. When she looked at him, he felt seen and dissected at once. What Broussard didn't notice, what none of them noticed, was the precision behind her gentleness. She never asked direct questions. She simply allowed men to speak, and men always do. They confessed without realizing it, how much cotton they had lost since the war, which soldiers they had bribed, which colored men they had punished. She collected every word. When she returned to her hotel room, she wrote it all down in a small leather journal, their schedules, their fears, their weaknesses. To her, they were not people. They were debts waiting to be settled. Her next admirer was Antoine Hier, a lawyer with a reputation for subtle cruelty. He had defended numerous knights accused of assaulting freedmen. His tongue was sharper than a blade, his arrogance polished by education. He prided himself on reading people, but when he spoke to Madame Defrin, his eloquence wilted. She met him with quiet amusement, offering no flattery, only attention. Within 2 conversations, he was sending her flowers. Within a month, he was visiting her every evening, under the pretense of legal counsel. She allowed it, but never too often, just enough to tighten the wire. The others followed. The hotel owner, the sheriff, the doctor, the banker, the judge. Each found a reason to be near her, each convinced their fascination was private. They began to compete in quiet ways, a glance during Mass, an invitation to dinner, a gift of imported wine. By June, the tension among them was visible. Their meetings grew shorter, their patience thinner. The bonds that had held their secret order together began to fray, not from external threat, but from within, the same hunger they had once projected onto the people they controlled. The hunters' discipline was dissolving under the gaze of one woman, and yet none of them saw the pattern. They saw silk, not steel. They saw mourning, not revenge. They saw a woman too refined to be dangerous, because their world had taught them that danger wore a man's face. When they laughed about her behind closed doors, it was with the smugness of power, the certainty that beauty was weakness. But that illusion would end in July, on a night so hot that even the insects went silent, when the first of the 11 learned what it meant to be truly powerless. Broussard's wife found him at dawn. His throat had been opened from ear to ear, his face serene, his hands folded across his chest like a saint. 2 glasses stood empty beside the bed. The room smelled of lavender and sin. The sheriff wrote it off as a freedman's vengeance. The coroner signed the report before the ink dried. But in the colored section of town, whispers began. Whispers of a shadow that walked on silent feet. A woman with skin like moonlight and eyes that saw through men's souls. They called her Lave Noire, the Black Widow. The name spread like wildfire, but only in the dark. No one dared speak it in daylight, because every time her name was spoken aloud, another man of power died before sunrise. By midsummer, Louisiana had turned into a furnace. The nights were no cooler, just quieter, the kind of quiet that felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. The crops had withered, the swamps stank, and tempers burned hotter than the air. When Thomas Broussard's body was found, the town called it tragedy. When Antoine Lairs was discovered 3 weeks later, the word changed to plague. The second death followed the first with eerie precision. Lair was found in his law office, sprawled across his bed with the same delicate incision from ear to ear. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, nothing stolen, only a faint trace of perfume in the room, the same lavender and smoke that had clung to Broussard's sheets. Dr. Hébert, the parish coroner and one of their own, examined the wound and felt a chill crawl up his spine. Whoever had done this wasn't improvising. It was surgical, practiced, deliberate. But men like Hébert didn't believe in patterns they couldn't control. So they buried Lair under the same lies that had covered Broussard. The sheriff announced another investigation, the judge sealed another report, and the rest of the town pretended not to notice the fear in the eyes of its rulers. Only the colored servants whispered what the papers wouldn't print, that both men had been seen with the same widow, the woman in black silk who spoke French like a hymn. At night, the stories grew. They said she walked barefoot through the cane fields, that her reflection never appeared in mirrors, that she could make a man dream her name and wake up choking on it. They called her Lave Noire, the Black Widow, and the name moved through Louisiana's colored quarters like a prayer made of smoke. For the first time, the same men who had preached dominance began locking their doors, sleeping with pistols under their pillows, and waking at every creak of the floorboards. When the third night died, the illusion of control collapsed. It was Dr. Hébert himself, found in his parlor chair with his throat open, his spectacles still balanced on his nose. His servants swore they had seen him alive minutes before, Pori, nung himself a nightcap, humming an old Confederate marching tune. Then they heard the glass fall and break. When they entered, he was gone, eyes half open, face disturbingly calm. Now there was panic, though no one would admit it aloud. The remaining 8 nights gathered in the hotel's back room, where the curtains stayed drawn and the whiskey flowed without measure. The walls that had once echoed with talk of power and politics now shook with dread. Sheriff DeVoe's voice trembled as he read out the reports. 3 men dead in under 2 months, all of them from the same circle, all killed the same way. "Gentlemen," said Judge Thiot, his words dry as dust, "if this is coincidence, then God himself is taking notes. The idea that one woman could infiltrate their ranks and destroy them was absurd to their pride, but too precise to ignore. They began to suspect everyone, federal agents, freedmen, rival factions within their own order, But none of their theories could explain the trace of lavender left behind at every scene, nor the subtle intimacy of the crime. Whoever the killer was, she had been close enough to breathe their air, to whisper in their ears before the blade came down. Celeste Dufresne still walked through town as though the world were asleep. Her morning gown swayed through the heat like waves of midnight. When spoken to, she smiled with courtesy. When asked about the murders, she frowned with delicate concern. "What a terrible thing," she would say softly, her eyes never quite meeting theirs. "To die with no absolution." The men felt uneasy under her gaze but couldn't stay away. They invited her to dinners again, to gatherings, to church pews beside their wives. Fear made them crave familiarity, and she gave them comfort like poison disguised as perfume. What they didn't know, what no one living would ever fully know, was that Celeste carried not only a blade, but a history soaked in blood. Her father had been a freedman in New Orleans, educated and eloquent, who taught reading to colored children in secret. The Knights of the White Camellia burned his schoolhouse to the ground with him still inside, while the townspeople watched. Her mother was taken 2 days later, never found. Celeste had been 16. She vanished into the night, and for 6 years her name disappeared from every record until she resurfaced on that steamboat wearing silk and a Parisian accent. She was not born a widow. She became one the moment the world took everything from her. Each death after that was ritual, a rebalancing of scales that had long been tilted. She studied her victims carefully, when they drank, when they slept, what they feared. She made herself the answer to those fears. To Broussard, she was tenderness. To Lair, she was admiration. To Hebert, she was faith. And to the others waiting their turn, she was the last soft voice they heard before silence claimed them. By September, half the knights were dead. The rest stopped meeting altogether, each barricading himself inside his estate with armed guards and prayer books. The newspapers still refused to print the truth, calling the killings acts of Negro vengeance. But even the lies trembled on their lips. Deep down, every man who had built his empire on someone else's suffering began to feel the invisible noose tighten. The Black Widow had become more than a woman. She was a haunting, a consequence, a story mothers whispered to children about justice that didn't wait for courts. And yet, there was something deeper than vengeance driving her. She was no common assassin, no random avenger. Each strike was precise, calculated, almost ritualistic, as if she were writing scripture with blood. She moved not like a killer, but like a priestess performing a sacrament. She wasn't erasing evil, she was balancing it. Those who survived began to unravel. They stopped trusting their servants, their wives, even one another. Letters were burned unread. The parish judge carried a revolver under his robe. The banker stopped sleeping indoors, and yet, for all their fear, none of them fled. Because pride is its own prison, and these men were its inmates, they stayed, waiting for a dawn that would never come. By autumn of 1872, the whispers had grown louder than sermons. No one dared speak her name in daylight, but at night even white mouths trembled when they said it. The Black Widow. The Veiled One. The Mourning Bride. Whatever they called her, they said she was judgment made flesh, sent by God or by hell to collect what men refused to repay. Fear had turned the proudest plantation owners into prisoners in their own homes, yet still none of them left. They believed Louisiana soil protected its devils. They were wrong. Breaux Bridge itself had changed. The air felt heavier, as if saturated with the unburied guilt of generations. Church bells rang hollow, and the courthouse clock began to lose minutes each day, as though time itself hesitated to witness what was coming. Freedmen walked differently through the streets, quietly, carefully. But there was something new in their eyes, a flicker of satisfaction they didn't bother to hide. For once, it wasn't their blood soaking the ground. The Knights of the White Camellia had always seen themselves as untouchable. They wrote the laws, they judged the cases, they owned the banks. They had rebuilt a small empire from the ashes of defeat, binding together the same old chains under new names. They thought power was permanent, like bone. But power is only the illusion of control over consequence, and consequence had come to them wearing perfume and silk. The fifth death proved that nothing could save them. Sheriff Devo, the man who had overseen the investigations, was found hanging from the rafters of his own barn. His throat wasn't slit this time. It was sewn shut with black thread. The coroner's report called it suicide, but the servants who found him saw the truth. The stitches were too neat, too deliberate, and the thread smelled faintly of lavender. A new signature, a new message. The pattern was no longer simply vengeance. It had become performance, a ritual carved into the flesh of Louisiana's old order. Every death carried symbolism. The banker was drowned in a tub filled with his own ink-stained ledgers. The judge died at his desk with scales of brass melted into his palms. The hotel owner, whose establishment had housed the secret meetings, was found buried beneath the floorboards of his own wine cellar. Each scene told a story, an accusation too poetic for coincidence. The white newspapers in New Orleans published sanitized fragments of the truth. Lawless elements terrorize St. Martin Parish. Vigilante murders continue. Authorities seek radical freedmen. But the freedmen's churches told it differently. Their preachers didn't name her aloud, but they told their congregations that justice walks on quiet feet, and that God sometimes wears unfamiliar faces. In backrooms and candlelit chapels, the story of Lave Noire transformed from rumor into myth. They said she moved through walls, that she could taste lies on a man's breath, that she never touched a weapon, but men did when she whispered their names. They said she was not one woman but many, that she had no age, no nation, that she had been born every time a whip cracked and reborn every time a woman wept over a burned house. They said her eyes had seen the ships come from Africa, and her hands had written the Declaration of Judgment centuries before America wrote its Declaration of Independence. She had become something larger than blood. Even those who didn't believe the myths could feel them. Fear is contagious, and the Black Widow's legend spread like fever. The remaining knights began to turn on each other. Suspicion hollowed them from within. Some accused their own servants of betrayal. Others began drinking until they blacked out, terrified that sleep itself had become an accomplice. The last few who still gathered did so in silence, their eyes darting toward the windows. Their arrogance was gone. They didn't talk about preserving civilization anymore. They talked about survival. One night, in late October, Judge Theot gathered the last 4 knights in his study. The candles burned low, and the wind pressed against the shutters like a living thing. They made a pact, a plan to end it. They would leave Breaux Bridge by morning, ride south to New Orleans, and never return. They swore it on their families, their wealth, their pride. But pride is the most useless oath a dying man can make. Because as they left that night, something unseen followed them. They found Theot the next morning in his study, the ink on his resignation letter still wet, his pen embedded in his throat. The letter read, "There is no law here anymore." The surviving 3 never made it to New Orleans. Their carriages were found along the Bayou Road, horses gone wild, passengers missing. Days later, fishermen found their bodies drifting among the reeds. The skin around their throats was pale and smooth, cut so precisely that the flesh had sealed back together like wax. Their eyes were open, their faces calm. By winter, Breaux Bridge had become a ghost town. The remaining white families fled north, leaving behind burned estates and silence. Federal soldiers arrived months later, too late to find witnesses, too late to find evidence. The case was closed without trial, buried under bureaucratic dust. But in the colored quarters, in the whispered histories passed down by midwives and teachers, her story endured. They said she had walked into the swamp after the final night, her black dress trailing through the water until the mist swallowed her whole. Some said the swamp took her. Others said she kept walking, into Texas, into Mississippi, into eternity. They said she was still out there, wherever justice slept. And so the myth lived on, because every society that buries truth breeds ghosts to dig it back up. Now listen carefully, because this is the part that most historians skip, the part they never teach in schools. Those 11 men were not just victims of vengeance. They were symbols of a system collapsing under its own lies. The Black Widow was not just a woman. She was the shape that guilt takes when it learns to use a knife. At this point, I want you, yes, you listening, to comment the words, "Justice walks unseen," twice. Write it and remember it, because the story you're hearing isn't about the past. It's about now, about how power hides behind civility and how silence becomes complicity. The Black Widow didn't vanish. She evolved. Every time truth is silenced, she returns. Every time a voice is crushed, she waits in the shadows, sharpening her blade. The swamp never gives back what it takes. It swallows whole the things men wish forgotten: bones, confessions, bodies, and truths too dangerous to survive daylight. In Southern Louisiana, water is memory. It moves slow, but never still, winding through generations like veins through the flesh of the earth. And beneath that surface, history waits. Breaux Bridge was no exception. When the soldiers came the following spring, they found the town half submerged, as if the land itself had tried to wash its hands clean. The hotel where the knights once gathered was nothing but charred beams and ash. The courthouse doors had been nailed shut. Rats nested in the judges' chambers. The soldiers pried open what was left of the parish archives, expecting to find tax rolls and property deeds. What they discovered instead was a pattern of missing pages. Every name, every document linked to the 11 dead men had been cut out cleanly, as if by a surgeon's hand. Someone had erased them from history long before their throats were cut. What few reports remained were contradictory. One officer wrote that the locals spoke of a fever, an epidemic that had taken the wealthy. Another claimed the town had been cursed, that a woman in mourning black had walked into the bayou and the earth had followed her. When the federal archivists arrived decades later to collect official records, they found only silence. Even the church registry from 1872 contained blank lines where marriages and deaths should have been recorded. The priest had written a single Latin phrase in the margin: "Silentium est misericordia." Silence is mercy. But silence is never mercy. It's the tool of the guilty. And in Louisiana, silence had always served the powerful. The freedmen who remained in Breaux Bridge built new lives in the ruins, small houses where the plantations had once stood. They told their children fragments of the story, never the whole thing. Too dangerous, too tempting. They said, "Mind your steps by the water." They said, "If you hear her voice at night, don't answer." To the new generation, the Black Widow was less a person than a warning. Do not let the old evil return, or she will come walking again. A century passed. The swamp reclaimed what men had built, vines curling around gravestones, moss hanging from the bones of chimneys. In 1961, when road crews began clearing land for a new highway, they unearthed the foundations of the Breaux Bridge Hotel. Buried beneath them were human remains, 11 skulls arranged in a perfect circle. The bones were bleached clean, almost polished. Each skull bore a hairline fracture at the base of the neck, not from violence, but from precision. The state historian called it coincidence, a construction accident. The files were sealed again, but there was one man, a professor from Baton Rouge, who didn't believe in coincidence. He traced every fragment of the Black Widow's legend he could find: parish records, oral histories, family Bibles, forgotten letters. His name was Dr. Samuel Kern. He spent 20 years gathering evidence until, in 1984, he published a paper titled The Veiled Avenger, Myth or Memory. It was dismissed as folklore, a southern ghost tale dressed in academic language. Yet hidden within his footnotes were details no one could explain, references to chemical analysis showing traces of rare oils, similar to 19th century embalming fluid, on the recovered bones. The implication was staggering. Whoever killed those men had not merely murdered them, she had preserved them. as though death itself had been part of a ritual, a message encoded in decay. Kern disappeared 2 years later. His notes, his recordings, even his personal correspondence vanished. Louisiana State University denied he had ever been employed there, despite payroll records proving otherwise. His colleagues stopped returning calls. The journal that had published his paper removed it from its archives. When a journalist tried to investigate in the 1990s, she received an unsigned letter in the mail. Some stories keep the South alive. Some stories bury it. Know which one you're digging up. That journalist, her name was Abigail Wren, died in a car crash outside Lafayette 3 weeks later. Her car caught fire before witnesses could reach her. Among the debris, a partially burned notebook was recovered. The only legible line read, "She was real. They made her disappear again." So what does it mean when an entire region conspires to erase a woman? What truth could be so dangerous that even the descendants of her victims still protect it? The answer isn't about murder. It's about power. The Black Widow didn't just kill men. She killed a hierarchy. She inverted the order of the world. A single woman of mixed blood dismantled the architecture of Southern supremacy, one throat at a time. And for that, they didn't just want her dead. They wanted her unwritten. The swamp keeps secrets because people teach it how. The families of those 11 men still own land in Louisiana. Their names still appear on courthouse plaques, on old oil deeds, on the corners of towns built over the ashes of Breaux Bridge. Ask them about 1872, and they'll smile politely, tell you the records were lost in a fire, that old ghost stories don't belong in modern times. But look closer. Every one of those families still leaves an offering each year, flowers, candles, coins, at the edge of the bayou where no church stands. They say it's tradition. They say it's for the ancestors. But you and I know better. They're still paying her to stay asleep. Because if Lave Noire ever truly awakens again, if her story rises from the mud and breathes in full daylight, she won't just haunt their families. She'll haunt every system built on the lie that blood buys authority. Every institution that confuses obedience with justice. Every man who believes his sins will stay buried simply because he buried the evidence deep enough. You think the swamp is still? It isn't. It's listening. And beneath its green skin, something old is stirring. The Black Widow's story didn't stay buried. It never could. Some histories aren't erased. They're incubated, waiting for the next mind brave, or foolish, enough to listen. And when they resurface, they never return as what they once were. They come back changed, sharper, angrier, hungrier. By the end of the 20th century, Louisiana had forgotten her name, but her fingerprints were everywhere, in the caution, in the half-spoken myths, in the way people lowered their voices when they spoke of justice. The rediscovery began the way all dangerous knowledge begins, with curiosity masquerading as scholarship. In 1997, an anthropologist named Mariah Denton from Tulane University started compiling oral histories from black families in St. Martin Parish. Her focus was supposed to be post-war migration patterns, not folklore. But when she played back her recordings, she found the same voice echoing across a dozen households, in different dialects, different generations, all repeating one name: Lave Noire. At first she dismissed it as cultural residue, a symbol. Then one of her interviewees, an elderly woman named Althea Rousseau, handed her an heirloom, a small locket sealed with wax. Inside was a miniature sketch, faded, water-damaged, but unmistakably depicting a woman in black silk holding a blade shap, head like a crescent moon. The initials C.D. were etched beneath. Denton recognized them immediately. Celeste Defrin. When she brought her findings to the university, the department chair laughed. "It's Reconstruction folklore," he said. "A metaphor for racial retribution, not a person." But Denton kept digging. She found correspondence in private collections, letters between plantation families written in nervous, coded language. The widow came to call. The stain remains. 11 debts collected. Her obsession grew. She traced land deeds, shipping manifests, and medical inventories from 1872 that listed chloroform and surgical knives purchased in quantities too large for any hospital. She discovered that several of the Knight families had received anonymous black enveloped letters during that same summer, letters that contained only a lock of hair and a date. All 11 dates matched the nights of the murders. Then, one evening in 2001, Denton vanished. Her apartment door was found open, her research files gone, her answering machine wiped. Police ruled it a break-in. But her students remembered something she'd said a week earlier during lecture. "Every time I publish a piece of this story, something disappears from my house." The university sealed her office, and the story might have ended there. But 3 years later, a graduate assistant sorting through mislabeled archives in New Orleans found a box marked "Property of Dr. M. Denton." Inside were photographs, maps, and an unfinished manuscript titled "The Resurrection of the Unwritten." It began with one line: "The Black Widow was never one woman. She was a system correcting itself." That line was enough to awaken the legend again, this time in the digital age. Conspiracy forums dissected every word, Reddit threads mapped her supposed route through Louisiana, TikTok creators stitched her image into modern revenge myths. A new generation of men raised on algorithms and outrage, stumbled across her name and felt a strange mix of fascination and fear. She wasn't just a ghost from the past anymore. She had become an archetype, the embodiment of consequences catching up. But the most unsettling discoveries came not from folklore lovers, but from data analysts. In 2015, a cybersecurity researcher studying leaked archives of Reconstruction-era court records noticed something chilling. Metadata in digitized files had been altered. 11 case files from St. Martin Parish, corresponding to the same year as the murders, were digitally corrupted. But in each corrupted header, one phrase appeared repeatedly, written in binary code: 1111X Lave Noire. Someone, or something, was editing the past. Soon after, government repositories reported unexplained deletions. University servers crashed when researchers tried to access 19th century legal documents. The pattern followed Denton's trail exactly, as if the story itself resisted exposure. Even now, archivists whisper that some files in Louisiana's digital database won't open, and when they try, a faint smell of lavender lingers in the room. You might think that's superstition. Maybe it is. But here's the truth they won't print. The systems of power that tried to erase her still exist. They've only changed uniforms. The plantation became the corporation. The Knights became the boardroom. The judge became the algorithm deciding whose voice gets silenced. The old order never died. It just learned to code. And like before, it fears one thing above all: reckoning. The Black Widow's story isn't about a woman murdering men. It's about a story murdering lies. That's why they keep trying to bury it. Because every time it's told, someone somewhere begins to see the invisible strings. Every retelling makes another man wonder how much of his success rests on the bones of others. And when enough people ask that question, empires crack. So here's the paradox. They can't erase her without resurrecting her. Each attempt to delete the record, each missing file, each vanished historian only feeds the myth until the myth becomes memory again. That's how the forbidden survives, not by force, but by repetition. If you're listening now, you're part of that repetition. You're breathing life into what they killed. You are, whether you realize it or not, another voice in the resurrection of the unwritten. And that's why you feel uneasy right now. Because some part of you recognizes that this isn't just a ghost story. It's a mirror. There is a rule older than any constitution, older than religion, older even than language itself. What threatens power must be forgotten. Every empire from Rome to Washington has lived by it. They call it erasure. The church called it excommunication. The aristocrats called it damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. Today, they call it content moderation, national security, or policy compliance. The names change, the function never does. It's the quiet ritual of deleting what should never have been known, The doctrine of erasure began not as a theory but as a survival instinct among the powerful. When a truth becomes too dangerous to control, you don't argue against it. You bury it. You rewrite the ledger, seal the file, call it classified, lost, corrupted, or insane. You label the messenger unstable, the witness unreliable, the victim unworthy. Erasure is not the absence of truth. It's the weaponization of silence. That's what happened to the Black Widow. Her story didn't die because no one cared. It died because too many people did. The institutions of the South, desperate to maintain their illusion of control, understood something most men never do. Symbols are more dangerous than armies. If the world learned that a woman, a freedman's daughter, had infiltrated and destroyed the very architecture of white supremacy with nothing but intellect, patience, and the blade of justice, it would have rewritten the myth of power itself. So they made her disappear. They burned the parish files. They paid off the newspapers. They replaced her name with superstition, her existence with metaphor. They couldn't deny her completely. The evidence was too precise, but they could drown her in narrative, make her too strange, too feminine, too vengeful to be real, turn her from a strategist into a ghost. That's how erasure works. It doesn't delete you, it misremembers you. It converts truth into entertainment until no one recognizes its reflection. That same mechanism lives today in every glowing screen, every headline that tells you what to fear and what to ignore. The machine learned from men like Judge Theot and Sheriff DeVoe how to control perception by burying contradiction. It learned that people don't need censorship. They just need distraction. Keep the surface noisy enough, and no one notices the bones being rearranged underneath. You see it in the way history textbooks still sanitize the South, calling slavery an economic system, calling genocide manifest destiny, calling resistance criminality. You see it in the way news cycles spin tragedies into talking points, victims into statistics, truth into content. Erasure has evolved. It no longer requires burning libraries. It just needs you to scroll. Psychologists call this the narrative dissonance effect. When the human brain encounters a truth too large, too corrosive, it rewrites it automatically to preserve coherence. In ancient times, it was myth. In modern times, it's media. But the goal remains the same, to ensure that you never ask the forbidden question, who benefits from my ignorance? Lave Noir's legacy wasn't merely vengeance, it was exposure. She peeled back the polite fabric of Southern civility and revealed the rot beneath. Every man she killed represented an idea that still walks among us. The entitlement to rule, the immunity of wealth, the assumption that guilt fades if it's dressed in manners. The Knights of the White Camellia may have died in 1872, but their descendants sit in different rooms now. Rooms with glass walls, digital screens, and quarterly earnings reports. They don't swing whips, they sign contracts. They don't burn crosses, they buy algorithms. And yet the effect is the same. Subjugation, repackaged for the modern age. The doctrine of erasure ensures that no one remembers the continuum. It fractures memory into disconnected headlines so that you never see the pattern. The systems of old power survive precisely because they teach you that they're gone. Ask yourself, why do we still have records of every Southern general's breakfast habits, but not of the women who dismantled their empires? Why do archives overflow with the papers of slaveholders, but the freedmen's letters rot in attics? Why do you know the name of every president, but not the name of the woman who slit 11 tyrants' throats? Because knowledge is hierarchy. To know is to hold a blade, and the first rule of control is to keep that blade dull. But here's the paradox. Erasure doesn't destroy truth. It distills it. Each generation that tries to bury it makes the next generation dig deeper. And every time someone like you listens to this story, every time a buried name is spoken aloud, the balance shifts a little further toward memory. That's why forbidden stories never die. They ferment. They transform silence into fuel. When Dr. Denton wrote, "The Black Widow was not one woman but a system correcting itself," She didn't mean a supernatural force. She meant that truth itself behaves like nature. It adapts, it evolves, it finds cracks in concrete. No matter how many times it's buried, it seeps back up, carried by those willing to risk madness or exile to unearth it. Look around. The same tools once used to suppress the story, printing presses, telegraphs, archives, are gone, replaced by networks that can't fully be censored. Yet the doctrine of erasure still thrives, because its core isn't technology, it's psychology. It whispers to you every time you feel exhaustion instead of outrage, every time you think, that's just how the world works. It numbs you with noise until truth feels optional. But somewhere inside you, something resists. A part of you knows that what you're hearing right now was meant to stay buried. That part of you, the restless, skeptical, ungoverned part, that's the reason Lave Noire existed. She wasn't vengeance. She was remembrance armed, and that is why the powerful still fear her. Because as long as even one man dares to remember her name, the doctrine of erasure begins to fail. Control has always worn a different face in each century. In the 1800s, it wore linen and rode horses. In the 1900s, it wore uniforms and carried flags. In the 2000s, it wears smiles and carries phones. The costume changes, but the structure beneath, the architecture of power, remains the same. It doesn't need whips anymore. It doesn't need crosses or hoods. All it needs is permission, and we've learned to give it freely. The South after the Civil War was not merely rebuilding, it was reprogramming. Every plantation burned was a data center reset. Every courthouse rebuilt was a firmware update in the operating system of control. The Knights of the White Camellia were not anomalies, they were prototypes. They proved that psychological submission could replace physical chains, and that model spread faster than the cotton trade ever did. They learned that if you give a man the illusion of choice, you no longer need to force him. That principle, refined and repeated, became the foundation of the modern world. Today, the descendants of those same architects of power no longer ride through towns with torches. They manage networks that light up your screens. They no longer dictate who can vote. They decide what you believe is true. The whip has become the scroll. The overseer has become the algorithm. Every time you open your phone, a silent plantation awakens, one that grows not crops but compliance. Data is the new cotton. Your emotions are harvested, processed, and sold back to you as convenience. Every headline that enrages you, every notification that interrupts you, every ad that just happens to know what you want, all of it feeds the system that keeps you docile enough to call it freedom. That's not accidental. It's the evolution of control. The same families who once owned the land now own the networks. The same institutions that burned books now fund media. And the same philosophy that buried Lave Noire's name now buries your outrage under endless distraction. This is why forbidden history matters, because once you understand how control was built, you can see its shadow in everything: corporations, governments, schools, even belief systems. It's not random, it's architecture. Psychological control operates on three pillars: fear, dependence, and repetition. Fear ensures obedience. It makes you crave safety more than freedom. Dependence ensures submission. It convinces you that your comfort is conditional on compliance. Repetition ensures normalization. It makes madness look like routine. This trinity rules everything from the 19th century South to 21st century social media. The same way planters made freedmen dependent on credit lines and sharecropping contracts, today's corporations make you dependent on dopamine loops and invisible debt. The method has evolved, but the geometry is identical. In the Reconstruction era, a man who questioned authority could be lynched. In the modern era, a man who questions narratives is labeled a conspiracy theorist and digitally erased. Different tools, same execution. The Black Widow's vengeance terrified her era because it reversed this geometry. She used the oppressor's tools against him. She didn't fight power, she infiltrated it. She became what they worshipped: grace, civility, beauty, and then made those illusions her camouflage. That is why they could not kill her without erasing her. To acknowledge her existence would be to confess that control could be undone from within. The architecture of modern control thrives because it has convinced you that rebellion is impossible. It rewires morality itself. It tells you that obedience is virtue, that convenience is progress, that silence is peace. But beneath that surface hums the same current that flowed through the 1870s, hierarchy disguised as order. You think you are free because you can speak, but freedom isn't speech, it's consequence. Who listens? Who acts? Who benefits? Those are the metrics of control, and they are calibrated so precisely now that rebellion looks like participation. When you rage online, the system profits. When you argue, it learns. When you despair, it sells you hope. Every gesture of resistance becomes another data point in your psychological dossier. This is how modern power sustains itself, not through violence, but through mapping. The knights of the 19th century drew maps of racial hierarchy. The elites of the 21st draw maps of emotional predictability. Both are cartographies of obedience. And here's where the Black Widow's shadow returns. She didn't just avenge her father's death. She disrupted a map. She broke the algorithm of submission in her time. She revealed the fragility of authority, showing that power exists only as long as the powerless believe in its permanence. That revelation, if repeated, is fatal to every system built on lies. That's why her story had to vanish, because if enough people understood what she understood, that control is an illusion maintained by narrative, then the entire structure of obedience collapses. And make no mistake, the men who run today's invisible empires know that. That's why their greatest investment isn't in weapons or armies, it's in attention. Because whoever controls attention controls belief, and whoever controls belief controls history, so they bury old truths not to protect the past, but to secure the present. They ensure that each generation starts from ignorance, believing their servitude is innovation. That's why they built the doctrine of erasure. That's why the story of the Black Widow still flickers only in whispers. But here's the paradox they fear most. Every act of suppression carries the seed of revelation. Every deleted record, every sealed archive, every censored thought is a signal flare to those who can still see patterns. You are one of them. You wouldn't be here otherwise, because once you begin to see this architecture not as history, not as myth, but as design, you can never unsee it again. And once you see, you are no longer theirs. Recognition is the first act of rebellion. It doesn't need a weapon, a banner, or even a word. It begins quietly, in the pause before you scroll, in the unease that flickers between curiosity and fear. That's where control breaks. Because the moment you see the pattern, the illusion of randomness dissolves, and the world rearranges itself into something terrifyingly coherent. That's what happened to the people who heard the Black Widow's story and truly listened. The pattern she revealed was never about murder. It was about design. She didn't destroy men. She exposed the invisible threads that had bound everyone for centuries. She made the unthinkable visible. And once you see the architecture of power, you can't return to blindness. That's why they buried her name. Not because they feared what she did, but because they feared what her story taught. You can trace the same geometry across history like fingerprints left in wet paint. The same three-stage rhythm: creation, control, concealment. First, something powerful is born. A truth, a tool, a movement. Then, it is captured, repurposed, and branded. Finally, when it becomes too revealing, it's erased. That's the life cycle of every forbidden truth. You can see it in religion, in politics, in science, in art. Humanity invents light, and power invents curtains. But every curtain has a flaw, a single seam through which light leaks. That's you, the observer. The system can manipulate everything except what you notice. That's why attention is sacred. That's why the stories they fear most are the ones that don't tell you what to think, but teach you how to see. When you listen to Lauve Noir's legend, what you're hearing is not vengeance, it's pattern recognition in narrative form. Her actions were metaphors made flesh. Each man she killed represented an institution that believed it was eternal. The sheriff was law without justice. The judge was order without truth. The banker was prosperity without mercy. And when she ended them, she wasn't taking lives. She was ending illusions. That's why her victims died smiling. They finally saw it too, in their last cons, that the world they'd built was hollow, and she was the echo inside it. Every era has its own Lave Noire, though most are invisible. Sometimes it's a journalist who prints the wrong truth, sometimes a whistleblower who leaks a forbidden file, sometimes a thinker who connects dots no one was supposed to connect. Each one dies in a different way, professionally, socially, literally, but the mechanism is identical: exposure, punishment, erasure. Because nothing terrifies the architecture of control more than a human being who can map it. You're surrounded by patterns hiding in plain sight, the headlines that alternate between panic and calm, the endless cycles of outrage and relief, the way every crisis conveniently leads to a new dependency. The world is not random, it's rhythmic, and every rhythm has a composer. Once you begin to hear that rhythm beneath the noise, something inside you shifts. You stop reacting, you start observing. That's the moment of awakening. The instant you realize the system's power depends entirely on your participation. It can only play its song if you keep dancing. The day you stop, the melody collapses. Lave Noire understood that centuries before anyone used the word psychological warfare, she learned that power doesn't need to be overthrown, it needs to be outgrown. The men she killed were relics of an order that could no longer sustain itself. Her blade was not revolution, it was evolution, a correction, as Dr. Denton once wrote, within the system itself. When you see the pattern, you inherit the same responsibility. You can't unknow it. Every time you watch a narrative form, every time you feel fear marketed to you, you'll recognize the fingerprints. And that recognition will isolate you, because most people will never want to see it. They will cling to the comfort of ignorance as tightly as the knights clung to their hierarchy. They'll call you paranoid, disillusioned, or obsessed. They have to. The truth offends their alignment. But that's the cost of sight. That's why forbidden history has always been the training ground of the free mind. It's not about nostalgia or fascination with the macabre. It's initiation. Every hidden truth you uncover, every buried story you resurrect, weakens the architecture that depends on your blindness. When you recognize that, you begin to understand what the Black Widow really symbolizes. Not vengeance, not myth, not even justice. She is the moment a lie loses its grip on your mind, the moment fear stops working. That's why she keeps returning. Through stories, through history, through us. She's not a ghost. She's a reminder. Every time power convinces itself it has silenced the world, she rises again, whispering through the cracks. I am still here. You can't erase a pattern that has already become consciousness. You feel it, don't you? The pulse behind this story, the realization that all of this, then and now, is the same architecture wearing new wallpaper. The swamp was never geography. It was metaphor. It's the murky, shifting ground beneath every civilization built on control. And like any swamp, the longer you look into it, the more you see your own reflection staring back. There's a point in every descent when the air changes, when the stories stop feeling like history and start feeling like a mirror, when you realize that what you've been calling the past has been staring back at you the whole time. That moment, the collapse of distance, is the true beginning of awakening. It's not about ghosts, it's about recognition. Because once you recognize her, you understand she never left. The Black Widow did not vanish into the swamp. She dissolved into the bloodstream of history. Her name was buried, but her principle survived. Quiet, contagious, waiting for each generation to reach the same breaking point. You can see her fingerprints on every reckoning that followed. In the strikes, the protests, the leaks, the whistleblowers who vanish, the cameras that malfunction when truth stands in front of them. She's there, not as a person, but as a pulse, moving beneath every rebellion that refuses to die. She was never meant to become legend. Legends comfort people. Legends live in the past where they can't do harm, but she was not built to comfort. She was built to remind. Every time her story is told, it pulls something buried back into the light. That's why those who guard the archives hate her name. They understand that remembering her isn't nostalgia, it's contagion. Because once you remember her, you start remembering everything else they taught you to forget. The institutions that silenced her still function, but their tools have evolved. They don't send sheriffs or judges anymore. They send narratives. They send screens that predict your every thought. They send convenience dressed as mercy. They want you to forget that control needs your permission. They want you to believe obedience is the same as peace. But every now and then, something cracks the rhythm. A story slips through, a forbidden name resurfaces, a pattern reveals itself, and suddenly the architecture trembles again. That's what's happening now. You're listening to words they buried a century and a half ago, and something in you recognizes their weight. That unease crawling up your spine isn't fear, it's memory. It's the oldest part of you remembering that freedom doesn't come from permission, it comes from perception. Once you see, you can't be ruled the same way again. That's what Lave Noire represents. She is not the blade. She is the moment before the blade falls, the awareness that precedes transformation. When her victims died, their expressions were not of terror, but serenity. That detail has always haunted me. Why would men who built their lives on fear die smiling? Because in their final second, they saw the truth. The order they thought eternal was a lie that could end in a single heartbeat. Power isn't divine, it's administrative. It exists only as long as the powerless agree to it. When they saw her, they saw the end of that agreement. And that realization, terrifying and liberating at once, was the first honest thing they'd felt in their lives. You live in a world built by their descendants, but also haunted by their mistakes. The plantations are gone, but the hierarchies remain, coded into economies, laws, and screens. You don't need whips to control people who have learned to control themselves. You just need to feed them fear of what happens if they stop obeying. But fear is brittle. It cracks under awareness. The more people see the pattern, the more the structure shivers. Every story like this one is a fracture line. That's why it's dangerous. That's why it disappears and reappears like a pulse beneath the floorboards of time. You can burn archives, delete files, censor books, silence witnesses, but you can't kill the whisper that lives inside awareness. The more you try to suffocate it, the more it spreads. The Black Widow understood that. She didn't want followers or monuments, she wanted memory, because memory is the one weapon that power cannot confiscate. So here you are, at the edge of the swamp again, listening, watching, realizing. The same stillness that fell over Bro Bridge in 1872 has fallen over your own life now. You can feel it in every half-truth, every manipulation, every polite lie that coats the world around. And you. The air is heavy again. And somewhere, beyond the reach of cameras and headlines, something moves. Maybe it's her. Maybe it's the part of you she awakened. Because if there's one lesson buried in the mud and blood of that summer, it's this. Justice doesn't die. It waits. It waits in silence. It waits in stories. It waits in people who stop pretending not to see. The Black Widow has never needed a body to return. She exists wherever awareness cuts through illusion. She exists in anyone who refuses to look away. That's why she was feared. That's why she was erased. And that's why she can't be killed. So listen carefully. The legend is not about her. It's about you. You who have seen the pattern. You who cannot unsee it now. You who understand that every system of control depends on the silence of those who see through it. The swamp doesn't keep secrets forever, it keeps receipts. And one day, when the surface breaks again, when the air thickens with the scent of lavender and retribution, when the powerful begin to smile in their sleep, she will walk again, not as a ghost, not as vengeance, but as memory wearing your face.